Welcome to a beginner's guide to philosophy of mind. This episode is based on Ian Ravenscroft's excellent book on the subject, and I've largely followed his structure here, with a few key modifications. Philosophy of mind can be quite abstract, so I've included animations throughout the episode to visually explain key concepts. We'll start by exploring what mental states are, covering major theories like substance dualism, behaviorism, identity theory, functionalism, and fictionalism. Then we'll dive into two perspectives that treat the mind as a kind of machine: computationalism and connectionism. Now, I've skipped a section from the book called Mind in a Physical World because, frankly, I found it a bit too niche for this episode. Instead, I've added something I think is far more relevant and fascinating: Gödel's Incompleteness Theorem and its implication for computationalism and AI. And then, lastly, we arrive at the big questions of consciousness. We'll break it down into 4 distinct kinds of consciousness before we take a deep dive into phenomenal consciousness and the metaphysical doctrine of Epiphenomenalism. I've provided chapters below if you want to jump between sections. So now, let's get started. The problem with Descartes' famous "I think, therefore I am" isn't that it's wrong, it's that it's ultimately worthless. In this video, I'll break down his argument and explain why it leads to a philosophical dead end. Descartes thought that the soul had a special seat within the pineal gland, located in the middle of the brain between the thalamic bodies. Here. Descartes reasoned this way because he thought that we have pairs of many things. The hippocampus comes in 2, the amygdala comes in 2, but the pineal gland is singular. He concluded that this must be where the soul resides, controlling the body. The important point here is that, according to Descartes, the soul is a completely different substance than anything else we know, something that is not analyzable by either physics or chemistry. To understand why Descartes believed in this immaterial soul, we need to explore his method of the systematic doubt. By the way, a lot of inspiration for this episode is drawn from this book by Ian Ravenscroft, Philosophy of Mind. Descartes, who was also a scientist, thought that much of science didn't stand on a solid ground, so he set out to find an unquestionable truth, a solid foundation on which he could build science. To find this solid rock, he asked himself, what can be doubted? For instance, our senses seem questionable. Put a pencil into water and it looks bent. Our senses may deceive us. Maybe it's even possible that an evil demon is conjuring up everything I perceive. So it seems that we can doubt everything, right? Well, no, because Descartes realized that there is one thing that is impossible to doubt, that he is doubting. We can lay this out in a simple argument. If I am doubting, then I am thinking. I am doubting, therefore I am thinking. And therefore we can conclude that something must exist that is performing the thinking. This argument is not only valid, it's a straightforward modus ponens argument, but it's also sound since both the premises are true. Well, maybe the I part can be questioned. Anyways, Descartes himself wrote, "But immediately afterwards I became aware that, while I decided thus to think that everything was false, it followed necessarily that I who thought thus must be something. And observing that this truth, I think, therefore I am, was so certain and so evident that all the most extravagant suppositions of the skeptics were not capable of shaking it. I judged that I could accept it without scruple as the first principle of the philosophy I was seeking. So here we have a fundamentally sound and true argument. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that ultimately it's a philosophical dead end. Let me elaborate. Descartes argues further that since I can doubt that I have a body, but I cannot doubt that I am thinking, my mind, the thinking thing, is distinct from the body. Hence, substance dualism. Now, here's the first problem. We can't get anywhere from here. The only thing we've concluded is what's commonly called solipsism. The idea that the only thing that exists in the universe is my own mind and my perceptions. Descartes escapes this conclusion through God. He claims that since God exists, and he would never deceive him, he can trust that the external world exists. But I guess if you don't believe in God, sorry, I guess you're stuck in a solipsistic nightmare. What do you think? Is there another way out of this conclusion? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Let's look at some more issues. Descartes corresponded frequently with Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, who posed a tough question he never really answered. According to Descartes, two things are true. 1. The mind and the body are entirely different substances, as we've discussed. And 2. The mind and body causally interact. Well, there is huge tension here, right? Elizabeth simply asked that if the mind and body are so distinct, how do they interact? How can the mind, which is an utterly different substance than the body, cause the body to move, for example? Another problem is that the postulation of a distinct substance is unnecessary, really. It seems that we can explain a lot of our mental activities without invoking a non-physical substance. Within metaphysics, it's sort of a sin, so to say, to postulate entities if we don't need them in order to explain things. And most modern physiology can explain a lot of mental functions without appealing to something non-physical. Let's say that I have a big fear of stepping on Lego. I mean, who doesn't, right? When I see a piece of Lego, the image stimulates my retina, sending signals to the visual cortex, where the Lego is recognized. This information is then relayed to my amygdala, triggering a fear response. In turn, the amygdala sends signals to the motor cortex, which activates my legs, causing me to walk away. This causal chain is incredibly simplified, but the point is that we can explain such chains without appealing to anything immaterial. So, why should we believe in something like an immaterial soul at all? Just to be clear, Descartes thought that all mental functions really, whether it's logical reasoning or solving math problems, were done by the immaterial soul. The rest of the brain is not really doing anything but obeying the soul's command from the pineal gland. And this seems unlikely. But maybe some might argue that the immaterial soul is responsible for consciousness. After all, consciousness is, as we'll see, a major problem for many theories within philosophy of mind. But we'll get to that in future episodes. But the biggest problem with substance dualism, I would say, is its very weak explanatory power. In Ravenscroft's book, he outlines 6 general features of minds that any good theory must account for, or at the very least give us good reasons to explain away. 1. Some mental states are caused by external states of the world. For example, stepping on Lego causes the mental state of pain. 2. Some mental states causes actions. Just like in the fear of Lego example, right? 3. Some mental states cause other mental states. For instance, my belief that it's Saturday combined with my belief that Saturday is a day off causes my belief that I can relax today. 4. Some mental states are conscious. We have both conscious and unconscious mental states. We process millions of sensory inputs all the time, but only a few becomes conscious. 5. Some mental states are about things in the world. If I think about my piano, my thoughts are about something external of myself. 6. Some kinds of mental states are systematically correlated with certain kinds of brain states. This we know thanks to the advancements within neuroscience. The issue with substance dualism is that it doesn't really explain or illuminate any of these features, and that's what I mean by the cogito being a philosophical dead end. Descartes may have found an unquestionable truth, but it's a truth that explains nothing about the mind really. Essentially, worthless. One might say, doesn't he at least explain consciousness? No, because Descartes thought that all mental states were handled by the immaterial soul, meaning he didn't distinguish between conscious and unconscious mental states. Perhaps instead of substance dualism, we should consider property dualism, but we'll save that for another episode. Does pain exist in any real sense? Because according to philosophical behaviorists, pain is merely a disposition to act in certain ways. For instance, if I step on a Lego, I feel pain, but this pain, behaviorists argue, is simply my tendency to jump up and down or rub the sore spot, cry or react in other ways. Pain, like any other mental state, is only a disposition to act. So, in a way, the mind doesn't truly exist in this theory. Well, I guess that depends on what you mean by existing. Consider glass, for example. We say it has a disposition to break if it's struck. But does this disposition to be fragile actually exist? Oh, by the way, much of inspiration for this episode is taken from this book by Ian Ravenscroft, Philosophy of Mind, which is a fantastic read if you're into this kind of stuff. A key aspect of behaviorism is its physicalism, meaning that whatever is going on in here is made out of the same material as everything else in the world. We've discussed before Descartes' substance dualism, which argues that mental states are distinct from the body, composed out of something that isn't analyzable by physics. Philosophical behaviorism, in contrast, asserts that mental states are fully physical as they are merely dispositions. To clarify, philosophical behaviorists don't claim that there's a fixed way to react to pain. People vary, so it would be odd if we all responded identically. Pain isn't limited to behaviors like rubbing a sore spot or crying, for instance. Everyone reacts differently. This may seem counterintuitive. You might think, I know what pain feels like, and it isn't just my way of reacting to it. But behaviorists argue this way in part because of the verification principle of meaning, which states that a statement is meaningful if and only if it is either empirically verifiable or analytically true. Empirically verifiable means that we can confirm it through our senses in some way. Analytically true refers to statements like, every bachelor is unmarried. We know this is true by the meaning of the terms, not by experience. This principle was central to the logical positivist movement, which was highly critical of any metaphysical claims, things we can't verify with our senses. such like Descartes' immaterial soul, for instance. The critical point here is that I can't empirically verify someone else's mental states. I can't look into another person's mind to see if they're in pain or not, but I can observe their behavior and infer a likely mental state based on it. This removes the spookiness, so to say, out of mental states, making them concrete and observable. Is it a successful approach? I'll leave that for you to decide. But I should mention that the verification principle of meaning is almost universally rejected today for several reasons. One major issue, for instance, is that it's self-defeating. We can't empirically verify the principle itself, and it doesn't seem to be true by virtue of its own terms, right? But that's probably not a major issue for behaviorism. Behaviorism's strength lies in highlighting the strong connection between dispositions and mental states. For example, if I crave coffee, I'm inclined to get one. If someone claims they constantly yearns for coffee but never acts on it, we might think they are probably lying, right? So there seems to be a necessary link between certain mental states and corresponding dispositions. However, this view might feel strange because we're so used to thinking of mental states as private experiences, personal, internal sensations that we might express but don't always act out. Behaviorism challenges this directly, suggesting that mental states aren't inner experiences, but only behavioral tendencies. This is a big challenge since it contradicts our common sense understanding of mental states, at least I would say. But now let's explore some more serious issues. First, we have a strong intuition that certain mental states cause other mental states. For example, if I believe today is Sunday and I believe Sunday is a day off, those beliefs lead me to believe that I can relax. But can behaviorism account for this causal chain? No, it seems not, right? It can only explain why someone relaxes on Sundays without addressing the mental states leading to that action, right? Another significant issue involves scenarios like the superstoic and the perfect pretender. Imagine Paul. He has a rare condition that prevents him from feeling pain. Even if he steps on a Lego, he feels nothing. But Paul is embarrassed about his condition, so he learned to imitate behaviors associated with pain so convincingly that no one suspects his condition. When a behaviorist observes Paul stepping on Lego, they'd conclude that he's in pain, but we know in fact that he isn't, right? Here, behavior alone doesn't reveal whether someone is experiencing pain. Imagine Percy, who grew up in a community that treats Marcus Aurelius' meditations like it were the Bible, and he was trained from a very young age. When Percy steps on a Lego, he feels excruciating pain, but has trained himself not to show any reaction. A behaviorist observing him would conclude that he isn't in pain because he doesn't react at all. These examples show that behavior is neither necessary nor sufficient to determine if someone is in pain. This is a significant challenge for philosophical behaviorism. Before we wrap up behaviorism, let's touch on another related approach, methodological behaviorism. This approach aims to predict behavior based on observable stimuli and responses. For instance, if a rat in a cage pulls on a lever when and only when the light is on, it receives food. The rat learns that pressing the lever when the light is on results in food. From this, we can pretty safely predict that whenever we turn the light on, the rat will pull the lever. So here we've discovered a strong connection between a specific stimulus, the light, and its behavior, the lever press. But can we truly make reliable connections between stimulus and behavior in the complexities of human life? There are other issues as well. Neither philosophical nor methodological behaviorism addresses the problem of consciousness. Any theory that overlooks consciousness, in my opinion, is incomplete. Is the mind identical to the brain? Well, in 1848, a man named Phineas Gage survived the most unlikely accident. A premature explosion sent an iron rod directly through his skull and brain. Though he miraculously survived, those who knew him claimed that he was no longer Gage. So, if his personality changed, does that mean personality is part of the brain? This story is one of the most incredible stories I have ever heard, and it is indeed true, but there's one detail that is very often misrepresented, and it's not what you'd expect. Within philosophy of mind, the story of Phineas Gage is sometimes used as an argument against any dualistic theory, such as Descartes'. Descartes claimed that the brain and mind are distinct substances. But if Gage's personality was altered by the accident, and if the mind were separate from the brain, then we wouldn't expect any changes in his personality, would we? Oh, by the way, much of inspiration for this episode is taken from this book by Ian Ravenscroft, Philosophy of Mind. In contrast to Descartes' theory, there is the identity theory, which simply states that the mind and brain are the same thing. The mind is identical to the brain, hence the name, identity theory. The identity theory itself is quite old. Even Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century seemed to support a version of it. It's also a very straightforward theory. It simply asserts that every mental state is a brain state. Importantly, though, it does not claim that for every brain state there is a corresponding mental state. The Australian philosopher J.J.C. Smart articulated this theory more precisely in this article, Sensations and Brain Processes. He argued that the relationship between mind and brain is like that of between lightning and electrical discharge. Lightning simply is a form of electrical discharge. They're the same thing. When I say that a sensation is a brain process, or that lightning is an electrical discharge, I am using is in the sense of strict identity, just as in this case necessary, proposition 7 is identical with the smallest prime number greater than 5. To fully understand this theory, we need to understand the distinction between types and tokens. Here we have two tokens of the type dog. Every individual dog is a token of the larger type or class of dogs. To elaborate, this is Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, a token of the type author. But this is also Charles Dodgson, the man behind the pseudonym. So he too is part of the type author. But the important point here is that Lewis Carroll and Charles Dodgson are token identical. They are the same individual. If I would have invited both Charles Dodgson and Lewis Carroll to a tea party, only one man would have appeared, right? But we can also establish type identities, identities between classes. For instance, the class of authors is identical to the class professional writers. They refer to the same type generally. Now, let's get back to the human mind. Within the human body, we have what is called C fibers, nerve fibers associated with transmitting pain signals. When these fire, pain is usually recognized within the subject. Now, for the type of pain, there is a corresponding, indeed identical, type of C fibers firing. Pain is a complex phenomenon, influenced by many factors. But for simplicity's sake, throughout the rest of this video, let's just imagine that C fibers firing is the only thing that does the whole pain job, so to say. It seems as though that we cannot have C fibers firing without pain. This gives us good reason to think that pain just is C fibers firing. One of the strongest arguments in favor of the identity theory is neuroscience, which shows a strong correlation between mental states and brain states. So it seems reasonable to believe that the mind and brain is the same thing. And it seems as though that the case of Phineas Gage that we talked about in the beginning supports this, doesn't it? But the problem with the story of Gage is that his supposed personality change was overly exaggerated by people who didn't really know him. So maybe the identity theory is flawed. How can mental states be identical to brain states if a metal rod can pass through the brain without fundamentally altering personality? I'm not sure. Maybe Gage was just simply lucky and the rod missed any parts of the brain that is crucial to personality. But there are additional challenges here. Probably the biggest issue here is consciousness. The identity theory claims that the mind is identical to the brain, but it lacks any explanation for why some brain states are conscious while others aren't. What's the difference between conscious and unconscious C fibers firing, for instance? Additionally, it seems to be in conflict with Leibniz's law of identity. Leibniz's law states that if two things are identical, then everything that is true of one must also be true of the other. For simplicity, let's return to pain. If pain is token identical to C fibers firing, then everything true of pain must also be true of C fibers firing. But that's simply not accurate. For instance, C fibers surprisingly have frequency, while pain does not. Or does your pain have a frequency? I think not, right? So it seems as though Leibniz's law is broken here. And we only really need to find one difference to conclude that these are two different things. Also, pain has the property of hurting, while C fibers firing does not. So they couldn't possibly be the same. But these objections seem more related to the problem of being conscious of pain. Maybe pain is C fibers firing, it's just that consciousness makes it feel a certain way. But still, the identity theory lacks an explanation for consciousness, so that doesn't fully resolve the issue. There's another major problem for the identity theory. If the identity theory claims that there is a type identity between pain and C fibers firing, then what about creatures without C fibers? If we meet an alien, it likely wouldn't have C fibers, yet it might still be able to feel pain. But if the identity theory is correct, then pain is C fibers firing. So the alien would never feel pain, which seems unlikely. This is known as the problem of multiple realization. There is an ingenious solution to this problem, though called functionalism. The most important feature of any object isn't what it's made of, it's what it does. Take a chair, for example. Its function is simple: to sit on. Whether it's made of wood, metal, glass, or stone doesn't really matter, right? As long as it does the job. In the same way, functionalism within the philosophy of mind asks, if a mental state performs its function, does it really matter what it's made of? Functionalism is one of the most popular views within modern philosophy of mind. It's a version of the identity theory which claims that whatever mental states are, they're identical to brain states. Whether it's pain, attraction, or joy, each mental state corresponds to a particular brain state. But there's a big problem within the traditional identity theory. In humans, neurologists have found that pain correlates with what is called C fibers firing. This gives us a good ground to conclude that C fibers firing is pain. And it is a strong identity claim, like saying water is H2O. But the problem arises when we discover that there are animals that seem to experience pain but lack C fibers. If we equate pain with C fibers firing, then any animal that doesn't have C fibers could never experience pain, which is absurd. If we meet an alien, it likely wouldn't have C fibers, yet it might still be able to feel pain. This issue is sometimes referred to as the problem of multiple realization. But this is where functionalism comes in and saves the day. One of my favorite philosophers, David Lewis, sketched out this idea in his paper, An Argument for the Identity Theory. The definitive characteristic of any experience as such is its causal role. The definitive causal role of an experience is expressible by a finite set of conditions that specify its typical causes and its typical effects under various circumstances. So here's the thing. Pain is simply whatever occupies the causal role of pain. Just like the chair we discussed earlier, it doesn't matter what it's made of as long as it serves its function. The same goes for pain. It doesn't matter if it's C fibers firing, alien fibers firing, or even computer code. If it performs the pain job, it qualifies as pain. To truly understand this, we need to explore what we mean by function. This is often described in terms of inputs, internal connections, and outputs. For instance, stepping on a Lego is an input, which causes pain. This in turn might cause me to react by jumping up and down or rubbing the sore spot. But also, it might create an internal connection leading to further mental states, like anxiety. This is a simplified explanation, but the point is that this theory not only addresses the problem of multiple realization, but also explains how certain mental states can cause other mental states. This theory is indeed amazing and ingenious, if you ask me, but unfortunately, like all theories, it has problems. To begin with, it seems that we still lack a full explanation of consciousness. Hey guys, it's me from the future. I just wanted to add a couple of things. There are two very famous arguments against functionalism, both of them posed by the one and only Ned Block in his paper, Troubles with Functionalism. Firstly, let's imagine a robot which has been programmed to react a certain way if it hits a piece of Lego. This robot even have code fibers, signals which causes the robot to react a certain way. But importantly, it reacts only according to its program. So when the robot hits a piece of Lego, it seems as though a functionalist is committed to say that the robot is in pain, while intuitively we would simply deny that, right? because it's only acting according to its program. There's no pain involved here. But this is actually sort of a strawman fallacy, since it characterizes functionalism too crudely. A functionalist would simply reply by saying that pain is not exhausted by one type of stimulus, the Lego, or by one type of outputs, the reaction, or even by one type of internal connections. The function of pain just isn't that simple. Pain can be caused, an input, by a myriad of things, and there are so many different ways of reacting to it, and there are also many different possible internal connections to pain. Therefore, even a functionalist here would conclude that our robot is not in pain, because it would react exactly the same way every time it gets exactly the same stimulus. But now, let's turn to another issue. Here comes a rough explanation of the problem he posed. Let's say we take this unnecessary chunk of meat out and replace it with a large group of very small people. These people have low intelligence, but are trained to simulate my brain's function precisely. Let's also imagine that there are about 86 billion of these small people, one for each neuron in my brain. When a particular stimulus comes in, each of these small individuals follows specific instructions to mimic my brain's behavior. If you observed me externally, you wouldn't notice any difference between me with my actual brain and me with my homunculus system brain. For a functionalist, there is no difference since both systems perform the same causal role. But intuitively, we feel there's something missing in the homunculus system, namely a qualitative feeling or experience. Bloch writes, "What makes the homunculi-headed system a prima facie counterexample to machine functionalism is that there is a prima facie doubt whether it has any mental states at all, especially whether it has what philosophers have variously called qualitative states, raw feels, or immediate phenomenological qualities." This is a major problem for functionalism, because it seems strange to think that a qualitative experience could somehow emerge from these individuals. It doesn't seem as anyone would feel anything. But why not? Perhaps our intuition tells us this only because we're used to thinking of mental states emerging solely within carbon-based brains. Why couldn't a large group of people sending signals back and forth produce an experience? We'll dive into this more in the upcoming episode about computationalism. So if that sounds interesting, make sure to subscribe. In the end, I think this is a big problem for functionalism. Although functionalism is an attractive position. Is the human mind just a good story we tell each other? A useful fiction, but just like all other fictions, not real? In this episode, I will discuss the possibility of our mind being unreal. Basically, whatever we discuss in philosophy, there's always that group of philosophers saying, "What you guys are talking about is wrong because it doesn't exist." If we talk about metaethics, there's Mackie claiming moral properties don't exist. If we discuss universals, there are nominalists like William of Ockham. And if we dive into the philosophy of mind, which is today's topic, we encounter the eliminativist Paul Churchland and Daniel Dennett, who is sometimes considered a fictionalist, although he resists this label. But we'll get to that later. Though eliminativism and fictionalism are similar, let's look at each separately. We'll start with eliminativism. To understand where Churchland is coming from, we need to ask, what does it even mean for something to exist at all? Consider atoms. Why do we believe in atoms? For years, even before the invention of the electron microscope, which provides images of atoms, scientists held that atoms best explained matter. The atomic model successfully predicts and explains various physical phenomena. So we have good reasons to believe atoms exist. Now, let's contrast this with the phlogiston theory of combustion. This is J.J. Becher. He proposed that flammable materials contain something called phlogiston, which enables combustion. Wood burns well because it had a lot of phlogiston, while non-flammable materials like rocks basically don't have any. This theory initially seemed useful, right? It explains why some things burn and why others don't. However, scientists later noticed that materials actually gain weight when burned, which contradicts the idea of phlogiston being released. If something leaves the material, it should become lighter, right? Eventually, combustion was understood as a reaction between the material and oxygen, and phlogiston was recognized as non-existent. Churchland claims that it's a similar case with the human mind. Folk psychology assumes mental states like pain, love, hate, and that they exist, but they're actually like phlogiston, concepts based on entities that don't exist. To elaborate, take this sentence: a witch is living in the forest. Many people back in the day thought that witches existed, in the same way that they thought that phlogiston existed. But the belief in witches was a terrible error that led to the murder of thousands of women. But the thing with this sentence is that it is always false, because there is no such thing as witches. In technical terms, it quantifies over something non-existent. Now, consider this sentence. Wood consists in part of phlogiston. This sentence is also always false because phlogiston doesn't exist, even though people once thought it did. Churchland suggests that perhaps this sentence, "I'm in love with her," is also always false, because it references a property that doesn't exist. But isn't this unintuitive? If I'm in love, I can feel it. I know that feelings are real, even more so than I know that this book is real. Churchland's reasoning here is that folk psychology is a stagnant research program, lacking progress. Meanwhile, neuroscience has made major advances. So he argues we should drop terms like pain, love, and anger and instead talk about neurological signals. This eliminates the talk of minds, hence the name, Eliminativism. Obviously, this wouldn't happen overnight, but it could gradually change over time. Now, an obvious problem here is that folk psychology is not a completely stagnant research program. It has made some progress. It's simply false that folk psychology is a dead end. Also, we have a scientific folk psychology, which derives much of its understanding from folk psychology. Claiming that scientific folk psychology is useless is likely wrong. And just imagine how awkward it would be to talk about neurological signals instead of something like love or pain. But perhaps the mind, while non-existent like phlogiston, is still just a useful fiction. Let's look at fictionalism. Daniel Dennett doesn't exactly label the mind as a useful fiction, but his views hint at a unique way of understanding it, which some interpret as fictionalist. According to Ian Ravenscroft, whose work inspired much of this episode, some of Dennett's ideas could be read as compatible with fictionalism. To understand Dennett's position, we need to look at his three stances: the physical stance, the design stance, and the intentional stance, which we can illustrate through a chess computer example. Suppose I'm playing chess against a computer. The physical stance analyzes behavior in terms of physical properties. Both I and the computer are physical entities made up of atoms, protons, electrons, and so on. Theoretically, we could predict our behaviors from this level, though this would be practically impossible for all but the simplest systems. The design stance considers an object's purpose. For instance, a piano is designed to produce sound when you press a key. If it malfunctions, I might go back to the physical stance to analyze the piano's physical parts and understand why it isn't working as designed. And the chess computer can be said to be designed to win chess games in the same way. The intentional stance, on the other hand, assumes that an entity, person, or even machine is rational and acts with intent. Imagine it's afternoon and Perry, who loves his afternoon coffee, is tired. We can reasonably predict Perry will make coffee because he's rational and likes coffee in the afternoon. Now, here's where Dennett's view becomes relevant. Even though Perry is a physical being, we usually find it impractical to analyze his behavior through purely physical properties. Instead, we find it natural to use simplified concepts like liking coffee or being tired to predict his actions. Dennett argues, if I have his position correct, that mental states like beliefs, desires, and intentions are real in a practical, explanatory sense. They help us to understand and predict behaviors. When we discuss advanced systems like the chess computer, the design stance might not even be sufficient to explain its behavior because it is so complex. Instead, we might say the computer wants to sacrifice its pawn, or the computer thinks this move is the best. But we know, of course, that the computer doesn't really want or think anything. It's just following complex algorithmic rules. But attributing these intentions is useful for us to make sense of the machine's behavior. Now, even though Dennett might not agree, to me it seems inevitable that we end up in fictionalism. Because if we attribute thoughts to complex systems, even though we know that they are not thinking, then why should we attribute thoughts to humans? But what do you guys think? Is the mind just a useful fiction? Is there any real difference between a computer and a human mind? As of today, I think there is a crucial difference, but we'll get to that later. Ever since Mary Shelley imagined Frankenstein, we humans have been fascinated by the idea of creating artificial life. So maybe AI today is just a modern version of Frankenstein. But could a sufficiently advanced computer ever gain all the capacities of the human mind? That is the subject of today's episode about computationalism. So let's get started. Computationalism is the idea that the human mind is quite literally a computer. But to truly grasp this theory, we need to know what it means for something to be computable. So let's discuss the Turing machine, named after the famous computer scientist and mathematician Alan Turing. In order to build a Turing machine, we only need 4 things: a machine table, a state register, tape, and a so-called head. The tape needs to be very long and divided into squares. The tape should actually be infinite, which makes the machine a practical impossibility, but we don't need to worry about that here. The head needs to be capable of performing these 4 tasks. 1. Interpret the symbol within each given square on the tape. 2. Switch symbol within squares. 3. Move between squares. Halt or stop all activities. That's it. And then we have the state register. The only thing it's doing is really storing the state of the machine. Don't worry, it'll all make sense soon. And lastly, the machine table is specifying the rules which the head acts upon. So here we have the full machine, and I've provided a tape with a specific sequence of 1s and 0s. So let's start the machine and I'll explain what occurs. The machine begins within the first state, which tells the machine to follow these 2 rules. If the head reads 1, then change nothing and move to the right and change to state 2. And secondly, the rule of if the head reads 0, then change nothing and move to the right and remain within the first state. So in the first couple of squares, the head only reads 0s, which causes the head to continue to the right and neither change the symbol nor the state. But here it interprets a 1, which causes the machine to not only continue to the right, but also swap state, which means that it will follow a new set of rules, which are if 1, then change nothing and move to the right and remain within state 2, and the rule of if 0, then change the 0 to a 1 and move to the left and switch to state 3. The machine moves on until it reaches the next 0, which causes the machine to swap the symbol and change it into the third state. The rules of the third state is if 1, then change nothing and move to the left and remain within state 3, and the rule of if the head reads 0, then no change and move to the right and switch to state 4. The head continues to the left until it reaches the next 0, which causes the machine to move to the right and enter the fourth state, which gives the head the instruction, change symbol and then halt. Now, let's look at the tape. In the beginning, the tape looked like this, but now it looks like this. You might realize that what the machine has actually done is calculating 2 plus 3. And as you can see on the new tape, we find a set of 5 1s. Now, this was a very basic example of computation, but what's amazing about this machine is that it is basically doing math, right? And in principle, a Turing machine is capable of performing all the tasks of a modern computer, provided that the tape is long enough. Now, the thing with the Turing machine is that it is being rational, a trait that before was thought of to be uniquely human. For instance, Aristotle claimed that the defining feature of humans was rationality. But a Turing machine is rational, isn't it? So now, the question is, could it be the case that the human mind is working exactly like a Turing machine, following algorithmic rules depending on what inputs we receive from the outside world? But instead of 1s and 0s, we have inputs such like a warm sensation or a cold sensation. What if we just switch out my brain with about 86 billion small people, one for each of my neurons, who are simply following Turing machine-like rules? Would all these small people be able to simulate my brain completely? Maybe, but there is one big problem here, and it is due to semantics. Let me elaborate. The thing with a Turing machine is that it is only really interpreting syntactic properties. For instance, let's consider this logical argument. If something has branches, then it has leaves. My company has branches. Therefore, my company has leaves. This argument is actually valid, but there is an obvious problem with it. If we change the argument into formal logic, a computer would have no problem whatsoever to conclude that this argument is a standard modus ponens argument. But what the computer misses is the semantic properties of the words. The word branch here is used with different meanings. In short, it has different semantic properties between the premises, which produces the fallacy of equivocation. But Turing machines can only interpret syntactic properties, i.e., the actual look or form of the symbol it's analyzing. To show why this problem is so severe for computationalism, let's look at a very famous thought experiment by John Searle. So, this is John. He is incredibly stupid. Oh, sorry John, didn't think you heard me. Anyways, John does not speak a single word of Chinese, but he is locked up in a room by himself in, let's say, Beijing. Suddenly, a set of papers filled with Chinese symbols slides into the room. John has no idea what they mean, but within the room he finds a book with a set of rules in English, which tells him how to proceed. John then begins to search for these exact symbols within the rulebook. Ah, he found it. If some odd symbols, then the same symbols and another set of symbols. He combines these symbols and slides it out. Outside the room, we find a Chinese man who began the whole process. The first set of symbols simply translates to "Hi," and the note that John sent out translates to "Hi, how are you?" The Chinese man outside the room thinks to himself, "Oh, the man behind the wall knows Chinese. How wonderful." But indeed, we all know that, in fact, John doesn't speak a single word of Chinese. He is simply interpreting the syntactical properties of the symbols and following rules, much like the Turing machine. Simply following rules does not grant meaning or understanding of the symbols. Therefore, the human mind simply cannot be a computer, since humans are capable of interpreting semantics, which a computer cannot. But there must be something wrong here. If it is true that computers are only interpreting syntax, then an AI like ChatGPT would never be able to recognize an argument that contains an equivocation, right? But it did. It correctly identified the fallacy. So maybe it's just a matter of complexity. Maybe Searle is incorrect. But importantly, there is a big difference between computationalism and what is called connectionism, which is more related to deep learning.
Artificial intelligence, AI.
Some AI models.
Thinking about AI for a long time.
Purely generated by AI.
Does an AI model work the same way as the human mind? The human brain, with its 86 billion neurons forming an intricate web of connections, might seem eerily similar to artificial neural networks that powers AI models. But how deep does this resemblance go? Connectionism argues that the human mind is just that, a colossal neural network, nothing more and nothing less. But if that is true, does that mean that an AI could one day truly think? Or are we missing something vital about the mind? Before we can dive into these questions, we need to understand the basics of what a neural network is. Here follows a rough explanation. This example is originally derived from this paper written by Gorman and Sejnowski. Let's say we have a submarine that wants to distinguish between mines and rocks. To do so, it uses what is called active sonar, meaning that it sends out a pulse of sound, and if the sound echoes back, we know that something is up ahead. But just knowing that something is up ahead is not sufficient for our purpose. The task is to know whether it is a rock or a mine we're facing. Now let's say the sonar has recognized that something is up ahead. The sonar signal can be divided into 3 parts: low, medium, and high frequencies. All of these frequencies within each echo vary in volume. Now, let's say that we've received 3 numbers from the sonar: 9, 1, 3. 9 represent the amount of volume in the low frequency, 1 the medium, and 3 in the high. Now, just by looking at these numbers, we cannot know whether we're facing a rock or a mine, so we need to feed these numbers into a connectionist system. Here is a very basic connectionist system. It consists of 3 different layers of nodes. The first is the input layer, second, what is called the hidden layer, and thirdly, the output layer. The input layers represent our 3 parameters, the volume of the low, medium, and high frequencies. The output layer represents the result. The left node represents a mine, while the right node represents a rock. We then insert these numbers we received from the sonar into the input layer, which activates the nodes in various degrees. Each node in the input layer is connected to the hidden layer, and depending on how much the connections are weighted, so to say, the hidden nodes will become active in various degrees. Let's say we put a weight of 0.5 between this input node and this hidden node. Here, the activation of the input node is 9, and what determines the activation of the hidden node is the activation of the input node multiplied by the weight of the connection, which is, like I said, 0.5. So at first, this node gains an activation of 4.5. But this hidden node is also connected to the other input nodes as well. So let's say that we have a weight of 1 here and a weight of 0.2 here. After the math is done, we have a total activation of this node of 6.1. How this hidden node in turn responds to its total activation is determined by a mathematical formula, which we don't have to get into here. But quite often, if a node does not surpass a certain threshold, it won't get activated at all. This procedure occurs between each input and hidden node. Then the same process of different connection weights is done between the hidden nodes and the output nodes. In the end, depending upon which output node that possesses the highest amount of activation, determines whether the system believes the sonar numbers represent a mine or a rock. So now we have the system ready for training. In order to proceed, we need a huge dataset in which we know each answer. Here, we know it is a rock, and let's say the sonar gives us the number of 3, 5, and 2. We then feed these numbers into the system and see how it responds. Here, the system thinks it is a mine, which is false, so the system made a mistake. A common way of fixing the system's mistake is done through what is called backpropagation. Roughly put, we need to trace the error from the output layer back to the input and adjust the weights until we have the correct result. This can be done manually, which is very tedious, I believe, but within modern systems we can use mathematics to correct it. This procedure is done through the whole dataset, and in time, after a number of fine adjustments of the weights, the system will be able to distinguish with great accuracy whether the sonar signal represents a mine or a rock. Knowing all this, we can begin to answer the question whether the human mind just is a connectionist system. If we only look at the structure, they are indeed very similar. A human brain possesses about 86 billion neurons. Each neuron can be seen as the node in the connectionist system. If they fire, they have received a big enough total activation from other neurons. So structurally, the brain just is a connectionist system. And there is great empirical data which supports this view as well. Researchers have found that it takes about 100 neurons to perform a perceptual recognition task within the human brain. This is sometimes referred to as the 100-step rule. And the good news for connectionism is that a highly functioning connectionist system can respect this rule. This result gives a big advancement over the computational theory of the mind. For a perceptual recognition task using only computation, it would maybe have to perform about 1,000,000 steps in order to do the same task. But now, let's move on into some problems. Much of this episode is based upon this book by Ian Ravenscroft. And the funny thing is, he gives us 3 problems for connectionism. But this book came out in 2005, and as you know, there has been a lot of progress within this field since then. There is one problem that Ravenscroft describes in this book that I just thought was super funny. Let me just read you what he wrote.
This is a promising result. However, it remains to be seen whether Ellman's approach can be scaled up to handle full-blown grammars and large vocabularies. Well, Ellman's approach isn't what AI today is based upon, I believe, but we definitely know that the problem of handling language and full-blown grammar is not an issue for AI anymore, right? It's truly incredible how well an AI like ChatGPT is handling language. But there are 2 other problems that I would like to highlight.
Firstly, the human mind learns way quicker than a connectionist system. For instance, my nephew, who's 3 years old, learns a new word every other waking hour, while a connectionist system needs a vast set of data in order to learn something basic with not much accuracy. So there seems to be something missing in this picture. Sure, when the system is up and running, it is indeed very quick, but the training process takes a lot of time. But lastly, the biggest problem of them all is that of phenomenal consciousness, which is indeed a problem for all the theories we've been discussing these past months. Let's just say that the human mind is a connectionist system. Alright, but how does phenomenal consciousness emerge from all these neurons firing? What produces the phenomenal quality of pain? Why does pain feel a certain way? Now, that is the hard problem of consciousness. If the argument laid out in this paper is correct, then there will never be a self-conscious AI. But why? It is due to a discovery made by the famous mathematician and logician Kurt Gödel called the Incompleteness Theorem. But what is the Incompleteness Theorem? And what does it even mean for something to be self-conscious? And can we really conclude that there will never be a self-conscious AI? This is the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes. He is one of the earliest proponents of what can be called mechanism. The idea that the human mind is just a complex machine reducible to mechanistic forces. According to this idea, the human mind is just a very advanced clockwork machine or automaton which is working according to certain rules. Now, if it is the case that the human mind is completely reducible to mechanistic qualities, then it must also be true that if an AI is advanced enough, it would be able to do anything which a human mind is capable of doing, right? So then if we can find one thing which a mind can do, but a machine cannot, then they are not the same thing. This is true by MacTaggart's principle, the dissimilarity of the diverse, which we don't really have to discuss here. But in 1931, Kurt Gödel published this paper which would shake the foundations of the mechanistic thesis. He discovered that for any formal system that is consistent and capable of simple arithmetic, and this basically includes all computers, then there is a formula which the system itself would never be able to produce as true, but which a human can. So if that is the case, there is one thing the mind is capable of doing which the machine cannot. And that means that MacTaggart's principle is broken. Hence, the human mind cannot be reduced to a machine. What the mind is hard to tell, but it's something different than a machine. Now, I think that Gödel didn't exactly come to this conclusion himself. This argument stems from the philosopher John Lucas. But in order to understand this better, we need to know some more about the incompleteness theorem. So let me just give you a quick and rough explanation of it. Every computer is an instantiation of what is called a formal system. Here you can see a formal system called Fitch, which I myself am familiar with. This system is created to prove formal logical arguments. Within Fitch, we have logical inference rules that can be used, and for each step down the tree, the rule of inference is specified within this column. Now, Fitch consists of a bunch of symbols, all of which can be assigned a certain number or code. After each symbol within the system is assigned with a code, we can produce an analog of the whole system on a piece of paper, together with all the possible operations. When this is done, from the code we can construct sentences or formulas that are self-referential. We are even able to construct this formula, which states, "This formula is unprovable in the system." Now, here is the big problem. The system itself will never be able to prove the truth of this formula, while we humans, who are outside the system, are able to see that it is indeed true. So the point here that Lucas wants to highlight is that since a human mind can produce this Gödelian formula as true, which the machine cannot, the human mind cannot be equated with a machine. And this is true by McTaggart's principle that we discussed before, right? Now, this might feel unintuitive. There are indeed many attempts to get out of this conclusion. For instance, the easiest attempt is just to say, well, yeah, Gödel, interesting formula you got there, but now we just need to add a rule to the system that identifies each Gödelian formula that in turn produces the correct result. This is unfortunately a mistaken solution, because by adding a new rule, you've effectively only created a new formal system which the whole Gödelian procedure can be reapplied upon, and we will be able to find within this new system yet another Gödelian formula. So the problem still stands. Now, I just want to make it clear, Lucas is not interested in claiming that a mind is superior to a machine. He's just claiming that they are two different things. But why is it that a machine is not able to solve this problem? Lucas argues that it is due to lack of self-consciousness. The Gödelian formula is self-referential, so it's asking the machine to analyze its own full capacity, which it cannot do. We're asking the machine to be self-conscious, which it isn't. But we humans, on the other hand, possess self-consciousness, so we have no problem with this. For instance, we humans have the capacity to reflect upon our own knowledge. We are able to know that we know something. And that's not all. We can know that we know that we know that we know something. And this goes on indefinitely. But this is not a problematic regress by any means. It just becomes pointless to keep on knowing that you know something at some point. Here Lucas writes, "The paradoxes of consciousness arise because a conscious being can be aware of itself, as well as of other things, and yet cannot really be construed as being divisible into parts. It means that a conscious being can deal with Gödelian questions in a way in which a machine cannot, because a conscious being can both consider itself and its performance and yet not be other than that which did the performance. A machine can be made in a manner of speaking to consider its own performance, but it cannot take this into account without thereby becoming a different machine, namely the old machine with a new part added." I don't know, you guys. Are you convinced? Because the father of modern computing, Alan Turing, claimed that it's just a matter of complexity. The human mind consists of about 86 billion neurons. If we have a computer that is able to simulate all of these neurons, would it possess self-consciousness? I think that it might, but self-consciousness is not the real issue here. I think that even if we produce a machine that is capable of doing such a thing, I think that it would still lack phenomenal consciousness. But that is a question for another episode.
For centuries, people thought that consciousness was one single unified thing, but that seems to be false. This is Ned Block, professor at NYU. Back in '95, he realized that scientists and philosophers were making one huge mistake. They thought that they had unraveled the mystery of consciousness, but in reality, they had only solved one piece of the puzzle, and the biggest problem of all remains to be solved. it seems actually to be the case that consciousness comes in 4 distinct types, each with its unique traits. But what are these traits, and which animals possess them? And could a machine ever be said to be conscious?
So, let's go through these 4 different kinds of consciousness. Let's begin with what is called monitoring consciousness. This idea was introduced by one of my favorite philosophers, David Armstrong, and it occurs when you are having a mental state about another mental state. For instance, if I believe that I fear Lego, then I'm having a belief, a mental state, about my fear, another mental state. This is sometimes referred to as a second-order mental state, a mental state about another mental state. This is actually not self-consciousness, but we'll get to that later. To elaborate, think of meditation. A common way of meditating is fixing one's attention upon one thing. It can be a certain sensation, like the breath, or sounds. But if you're a bad meditator, like myself, you sometimes drift off into other thoughts. But importantly, we humans have the capacity to realize this. In other words, have a thought about thoughts and redirect the attention. When this occurs, you're having a higher order thought. The philosopher David Rosenthal is a contemporary proponent of this kind of theory. He writes, "A state being conscious is a matter of mental appearance, of how mental life appears to one. If somebody is in a mental state but doesn't seem subjectively to be in that state, the state is not conscious. The higher order thought, HOT, theory explains that subjective awareness is due to one's having a thought that one is in the state." Now, I believe that Rosenthal would claim that that is the end of the story of consciousness. We need no further explanation than that. I do not agree, but we'll get to that later. Now, which entities possess this kind of consciousness? Humans, indeed, but also it seems that quite a lot of animals are capable of this kind of metacognition. For instance, certain great apes, dolphins, elephants, and even certain corvids. But actually, it seems as though a normal laptop is capable of monitoring its own program and registering whenever a certain activity is occurring. It is capable of having a second order, well, not thoughts, but you get what I'm saying. But would we say that a laptop is conscious? Certainly not. There's more to be said about the nature of consciousness. But I want to stress that monitoring consciousness is not the same as the next kind that I want to discuss, which is self-consciousness. I myself made this mix-up in one of my older videos, but it's excusable because I am actually not sure whether self-consciousness actually exists. But we'll get to that. It is commonly claimed that humans and maybe some animals possess self-consciousness, but in order to be self-conscious, one must possess a concept of one being a continuous self. What the self is, I believe to be a big debate within philosophy, but for instance, here the 17th century philosopher John Locke writes, "A thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself the same thinking thing in different times and places." What Locke is getting at is that the self is defined as a continuous stream of consciousness that perceives itself to be the same stream over time. With this conception of the self, it seems as though not many animals would qualify as being self-conscious. Maybe even only humans. There is the famous mirror test, where mirrors were placed near animals, and after some time the animals displayed behavior that they seem to understand that it is in fact themselves they are seeing in the mirror. So there seems to be some kind of consciousness of oneself, but does that really qualify according to Locke's definition? I would say that it is something different to recognize oneself in the mirror and to think of oneself as the same entity across time. Is there a way to test whether an animal possesses this trait? I don't know. Now, a problem here is, does the self actually exist? Because according to many Eastern traditions of philosophy, they claim that the self is an illusion. The brain is just a bunch of neurons firing, so there is no identity to talk about really. The idea of the self is just another idea like any other within the stream of consciousness. And if that is the case, self-consciousness doesn't really exist, and it collapses down into monitoring consciousness. Because if the self doesn't exist, it is merely a thought itself, which only makes it a thought about another thought. So this whole idea hinges upon the existence of the self. But what do you guys think? Does the self exist? But now, let's discuss what Ned Block refers to as access consciousness. Take this belief. I believe that Stockholm is the capital of Sweden. I know, it should be Helsingborg, but there's nothing I can do about that, unfortunately. Anyways, according to Block, this belief is accessible to me if 1. Is inferentially promiscuous, and 2. It's poised for rational control of speech, and 3. It's poised for rational control of action. Inferentially promiscuous means that I am able to use it as a premise in basically any argument, such as, everyone who's living in the capital of Sweden is stupid. Stockholm is the capital of Sweden. Therefore, everyone living in Stockholm is stupid. A fine argument, right? Rational control of speech, on the other hand, refers to if you ask me the question, what is the capital of Sweden? The correct information is accessible to me if I can provide you with the answer. And lastly, rational control of action means that if you ask me to show you what the capital of Sweden is, I am able to provide you with a Wikipedia link, for instance, or a book about Stockholm which claims that it is in fact the capital of Sweden. Block claims that the second one is not a necessary criterion, for instance, because it seems as though some chimps, which can't talk right, could still be access conscious. But let's talk about AI for a moment, because it seems as though a system like ChatGPT possesses access consciousness. It certainly ticks all the boxes provided by Block, right? If I ask ChatGPT, it is able to tell me what the capital of Sweden is, and it is even able to provide me with a link that proves it. And obviously, it can use it in any argument. But would we really say that ChatGPT is conscious? No, because I argue that it lacks the most important kind of consciousness, which is phenomenal consciousness. I would probably say that phenomenal consciousness is probably what most people think of when they hear the word consciousness. It is the having of an experience, a property of having what it is likeness. If we have two people enjoying a lovely sunset, but one of them is colorblind, then these two people have different phenomenal experiences. They have different properties of what it is likeness. But the concepts of access and phenomenal consciousness are very commonly conflated. But I think the easiest way to distinguish access from phenomenal consciousness is through AI, actually. If I ask ChatGPT, it can provide me with all the relevant information about chocolate. It is even able to give me a description of how it tastes. It is access conscious about chocolate. But now, has the large language model actually tasted chocolate? Has it put it in its mouth and felt the sweet sensation of chocolate? No, it has never possessed the actual phenomenal quality of chocolate. It is access conscious about all its qualities, but all these qualities are received from second-hand sources. It simply doesn't really know how it tastes, even if it is able to provide me with a correct, accurate description of the taste. But I guess some might reply and say that access consciousness, and indeed all the other traits of consciousness that I've been describing in this episode, is not really consciousness. The only thing that is consciousness is phenomenal consciousness. But the funny thing is that many philosophers claim that it is the same thing. This was the point of Bloch's article that we discussed in the beginning of this episode. Many authors in various texts begin to claim that they have an explanation of phenomenal consciousness, while all of a sudden they slide into an explanation of access consciousness. So I think that we should really thank Ned Bloch for the separation between phenomenal and access consciousness. Now, here is why I believe these 4 different concepts of consciousness exist. Because it seems that different entities possess different kinds of consciousnesses. We humans possess all these 4 traits, for instance. But most likely, few animals possess self-consciousness. But some animals seem to possess a degree of monitoring consciousness. But so do computers. And when it comes to access consciousness, we're most likely talking about humans and chimps and possibly some other highly evolved creatures. But also various AI models, right? But when it comes to phenomenal consciousness, I would say that probably most animals do possess it. There is something that it is like to be a bat, for instance. But no AI, at least not that I'm aware of at the moment, do possess this trait. This is one of the factors that make phenomenal consciousness one of the biggest mysteries within philosophy of mind. It is the hard problem of consciousness. So there is way more to be said about it. So that will be the subject for the next episode here on the channel. So if that sounds interesting, make sure to subscribe. But can consciousness really be 4 different things? I mean, it makes sense that it is, since it seems plausible that various things possess different kinds of consciousness. But maybe it is only one thing, and it's only a matter of complexity. When a creature or machine reaches a certain complexity level, it gains these various traits on the way. Maybe there's even a higher level of consciousness that even we humans do not possess. But what do you guys think? Leave a comment down below. I would love to hear your thoughts. Phenomenal consciousness is one of the hardest problems within modern philosophy. All the theories that we've been discussing during the past months have not succeeded in giving an adequate explanation of it. But there are 3 different solutions to this issue, but they are all radical and filled with problems. But why is phenomenal consciousness so hard to explain? And what are these solutions? Those are the questions that I aim to answer within this video. In my last video, I discussed 4 different kinds of consciousnesses, but now we're only concerned with the last one, which is phenomenal consciousness. Before we can tackle the first question, we need to understand a key feature within modern philosophy, and that is the reductionist agenda regarding ontology. What is ontology, you might ask? Well, ontos is Greek for being or that which is. So ontology is the study of being or what actually exists. One of the main virtues within ontology is economy, meaning we want to be able to explain as much as possible with the least amount of ontological categories. Anything we don't need, we should cut away using Occam's razor. This is the reductionist agenda. Let me give you an example. Take chairs, for instance. Plato would probably have argued that there is a perfect form of chairs, a form in which all chairs in our world take part in. So Plato not only postulated the universal of chairs, but he also thought that there was a separate world in which every universal resides, the world of forms. But this is unnecessary, really, because chairs don't exist. Well, obviously chairs exist in a way, but not the way Plato thought. Every chair in the world consists of atoms. So we don't need the universal of chairs. We only need the Aristotelian universals of atoms, for instance. Unless you're a sneaky trope theorist. In this case, we have explained the existence of chairs through its smaller constituents. We have performed a reduction. Now, the aim of modern philosophy has been to basically reduce everything in the world to atoms or mechanistic qualities or even sometimes functions. But the thing with phenomenal consciousness is that it resists this reduction. No one seems to have given an accurate scientific reduction or explanation of phenomenal consciousness. But maybe that's impossible. Now, let me just recap what I said about phenomenal consciousness in the last episode. If 2 people are sitting on a beach enjoying a beautiful sunset, both of them are possessing a certain qualitative feel, a property of what it is likeness. If they both are normally functioning people, their what it is likeness is, in theory at least, identical. But let's say that the person to the right is completely colorblind. Then these 2 people have fundamentally different qualitative experiences, or qualia. They are both looking at the same scene, but their experiences are quite different. But why is this such a big problem? Well, let's turn it up a notch. Let's say that instead of the second person being colorblind, he perceives the redness of the sunset as though it was green. So whenever he points at something exclaiming "red," he perceives it as green. The thing is that even though these 2 people have 2 very different qualitative experiences when they look at the same sunset, they are both 100% functioning. There is no problem for them to function within the world. This is sometimes referred to as the inverted spectrum thought experiment, and it seems to prove that qualia doesn't really have any function at all. Let's spice it up even more. We could imagine a possible world in which I live my life exactly the way I do within this world, except for that I experience purple as though it was red. The crux here is that Physically speaking, these two worlds are exactly identical in every way, but experience-wise, they are quite different. Therefore, qualia cannot be something physical. So the problem with qualia is that we cannot really analyze its existence through its causal role, because it's logically compatible with its absence. For instance, we can imagine a robot that functionally does everything that a human does. It even simulates pain when something happens to it. But even though it's functioning as a human, we have no reason to believe that this robot actually feels anything at all. It's not phenomenally conscious. Here, the philosopher Thomas Nagel defines consciousness. But fundamentally, an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something that it is like to be that organism. Something it is like for the organism. So, in the robot example, there is nothing that it is like to be that robot, since it lacks qualia. So, if qualia cannot be analyzed through its causal role, can we ever create a science of consciousness? Probably not. To elaborate, let's talk about bats. Just like there is something that it is like to be a human, there is something that it is like to be a bat. But can I, a human, ever possess a bat's what it is likeness? Probably not. For instance, I could imagine myself closing my eyes, hanging upside down, and screaming as loud as I can to try to sense my surroundings. If so, would I possess a bat's what it is likeness? No. Here Nagel writes, "It tells me only what it would be like for me to behave as a bat behaves." But that is not the question. I want to know what it is like for a bat to be a bat. Yet, if I try to imagine this, I am restricted to the resources of my own mind, and those resources are inadequate to the task. When we conduct science, we endeavor to be as objective as possible. In other words, we're trying to strip away all the particular viewpoints. Remove our specific individual points of view to an objective one. Within science, we're moving from the sensory appearance of things to actual reality. We're aiming to move from subjectivity to objectivity. But here is the kicker. The scientific move from sensory appearance to greater objectivity doesn't make any sense upon this matter. Because what we're after is itself the appearance. We're asking for an objective account of the subjective account. So this seems to be an impossible task for science. It's by definition a contradictory endeavor. Science is in nature objective, but what we're asking for is the question of subjective experience. This leaves us with what Joseph Levine refers to as an explanatory gap. Take these two statements. 1. Pain is the firing of C fibers. 2. Heat is the motion of molecules. Both of these two propositions have a felt contingency. In other words, heat and pain could have been identified with something else. But the second statement can easily be explained away, but not the first one. Levine writes, "The difference between the two cases is this. When it seems plausible that 2 is contingent, one can become disabused of this notion by noting that instead of imagining heat without the motion of molecules, one is really imagining there being some phenomenon that affects our senses the way heat in fact does, but is not the motion of molecules. But the sensation of pain counts as pain itself. We cannot make the distinction here, as we can with heat, between the way it appears to us and the phenomenon itself. Thus, we have no good account of our intuition that one is contingent unless we give up the truth of one altogether. We can indeed imagine someone experiencing pain without any C fibers firing at all. Take, for instance, the case of phantom pain. If someone has lost a leg due to some accident, she might sometimes experience intense pain within the lost leg. But how can that be? No C fibers are possibly firing within the non-existent leg. Hopefully you understand why this is such a big problem. But now, let's look at these three different solutions that I talked about in the beginning. Firstly, we have the eliminativist position. The philosopher Daniel Dennett is a proponent of this view. He endeavors to explain consciousness away, showing that qualia don't really exist at all. It's a mere illusion. I myself am not so fond of this view. I think it clashes with our common sense. And also, it's just odd to say that whatever you are experiencing is an illusion, which one can simply reply with, oh, so if what I am experiencing is an illusion, then what is real? If everything that I experience is an illusion, then there is no difference between illusions and non-illusions, upon which consciousness reappears, it seems. Secondly, we have the panpsychist view, which is probably the most bold view there is. This view claims that everything in the world possesses some small degree of consciousness. Even photons and subatomic particles experience things. And the more information or whatnot that gets concentrated within one area, the phenomenal experience compounds. So a human brain possesses a large quantity of information, therefore we have a lot of consciousness. I believe that the Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza held such a view. I reject this view for basically the same reason I reject Dennett's proposition. It clashes way too much with our common sense. We do not look at stones as though they are conscious. Claiming that they are is just way too much metaphysical hokey pokey for me, at least. A plausible revision of the panpsychist view could maybe be by claiming that only biological entities possess degrees of consciousness. And that sounds pretty plausible. But lastly, we have what I would call the ontological view. This is to, in a way, acknowledge that phenomenal consciousness cannot be fully reduced to something mechanistic. It is its own ontological category. Levine writes, for instance, I presume that the laws of gravity explain, in the sense at issue here, the phenomena of falling bodies. There doesn't seem to be anything left out. Yet I am told that the value of g, the gravitational constant, is not derived from any basic laws. It is given, a primitive, brute fact about the universe. So, phenomenal conscious could be the same, a brute fact of the universe. This does not necessarily entail immortality or anything like that. It just claims that The property of what it is likeness cannot be fully reduced to physical phenomena. But if it's not reducible to functions, does it have any causal power at all? Maybe, maybe not. But that will be the discussion of a future episode where I will be talking about Epiphenomenalism. Can science ever crack the code of consciousness? If the argument laid out within this paper is correct, then the answer is no. But if that is the case, then physicalism, the idea that the whole universe is analyzable through physical processes, is doomed. In this video, I will give a general explanation of what the metaphysical doctrine of physicalism is, and then discuss a very famous thought experiment that shook its very foundations. And lastly, I will discuss Epiphenomenalism. So, let's begin. Back in the day, when science wasn't that big of a deal, philosophers didn't really care that much about empirical studies. But nowadays, philosophy is more or less the handmaiden of science. If we make any metaphysical claim, and it is not directly compatible with the sciences, we indeed need strong evidence for why that is the case. Physicalism is the metaphysical doctrine which completely follows the sciences, and rightly so. Why should we at all listen to a philosopher who makes broad metaphysical claims that does not adhere to physical properties? Take, for instance, Descartes' claim of substance dualism. He claimed that the human mind was a separate metaphysical substance from the physical brain, a substance not analyzable by either physics or chemistry. This claim was based on logic alone, without any empirical justifications. Armchair philosophy at its worst, right? But it could actually be the case that we had empirical proof supporting Descartes' claim. For instance, it could have been the case that people have actual memories of past lives, which they could prove to be true, or any other empirical studies which proved reincarnation. This, unfortunately, we don't have. And we don't need the Cartesian ego in order to explain anything further. Therefore, the physicalist thesis still stands, at least against Descartes. But back in '86, the philosopher Frank Jackson wrote this article. Let's discuss it. What Mary didn't know. This is Mary. She lives in this little box, a box that she was born in. Everything in this box is black and white. There is no perceivable color whatsoever for her to experience. But within this room, there are tons of science books and even a black and white TV that provides her with modern science lectures. Since she doesn't have anything else to do, she learns everything there is to know about colors, even though she has never experienced such a thing. Let's say that she completely exhausted the whole subject of colors. She learns everything about photons, wavelengths, how the eye reacts, etc. But one lovely summer's day, she gets released from her black and white box and is let out into a field filled with tomato plants. She exclaims, "Good golly, now I know how y'all experience colors." Excuse the accent. Now, here is the problematic question. Does Mary actually learn anything new upon her release? I mean, it seems like it, but how can that be? Remember, she possessed all the relevant knowledge about how colors work, all the physical and causal functions, so there shouldn't be anything more here to learn. Here Jackson writes, "If physicalism is true, she knows all there is to know. For to suppose otherwise is to suppose that there is more to know than every physical fact, and That is just what physicalism denies. It seems, however, that Mary does not know all there is to know. For when she is let out of the black and white room or given a color television, she will learn what it is like to see something red, say. This is rightly described as learning. She will not say, ho hum. Hence, physicalism is false. An interesting solution to this issue here comes from David Lewis and Lawrence Nemiro. They claim that Mary does not acquire any new knowledge in the relevant sense. She does not learn anything new about the physical reality of things, but she does learn how colors are perceived. It's a difference between know how and know that. An interesting thought is that, in a sense, Mary does exist. It's just that her name is not Mary. Her name is ChatGPT, DeepSeek, or any other large language model. They can accurately be described as possessing all the relevant knowledge about how colors work, but they never truly went out into the world and actually experienced colors. Oh well, let's continue. Another solution to this problem, one which I believe Jackson initially supported, is to reject physicalism and claim that qualia, a property of what it is likeness, is a separate ontological category that cannot be reduced to physical properties. This idea is sometimes called Epiphenomenalism, and it is truly a crazy idea, because what it implies is that qualia does not have any causal function whatsoever. Remember, one of the biggest problems with Descartes' substance dualism is that his theory claimed that the mind was a separate metaphysical entity from the brain, but that they somehow causally interacted. But how can something that is not physical cause something physical to move? Well, that doesn't make any sense at all, does it? But epiphenomenalism escapes this problem by simply claiming that qualia, even though it's not a physical thing, is causally inert. It is only a property of the brain and not a substance itself. It does nothing more than provide an experience to the subject. A pain that you experience is a mere movie played up in your head. In other words, your pain does not actually move you. I repeat, your pain does not move you. Right. Even so, if things like experiencing colors are causally inert, how are we to explain traffic lights? How can I know that I ought to stop if the light is red? The qualia of red itself cannot cause me to stop if epiphenomenalism is true. So it's almost like Descartes' substance dualism would make more sense here. But that is absurd. Anyhow, well guys, we've gone full circle. We began a couple of months ago with substance dualism, and now we've ended in the same place. Before I end this big series, why is philosophy of mind so important, you might ask? Well, one big reason is due to ethics. Depending upon what the nature of the mind is, can have drastic consequences within our ethical thinking. For instance, if we were to conclude that AI actually possess phenomenal consciousness, which I highly doubt, but then we need to drastically change how we treat it. But if you want to know more about ethics, then I suggest you to check out this playlist here.